David.
He's falling in a beautiful swirling pattern.
David.
What is up, everyone? This is the David Wells Experiment, and I'm your host, David Wells. So today we're going to talk about the Sega Genesis. So I'll be honest up front. Forgive me, that sounded weird. Oh well, maybe it's because I came home and took a nap. Anyway, so yeah, I'm going to be honest. One of the reasons I'm talking about this subject is because I was looking at the analytics for all my podcasts, and I found out that the one that shows continued growth is the one about the Super Nintendo. So I thought, well, what better to try to replicate that success than talk about its rival, the Sega Genesis? So I might have mentioned some of these details before, but I'm going to try to expound upon them a bit. So for those of you who don't know, but if you're listening to this and you clicked on it because of the Sega Genesis, then more than likely you do know. The Sega Genesis was the rival of the Super Nintendo and the TurboGrafx 16 in the console wars of the early 90s. So it's funny is, I always find it so funny that every 5 years or so there are like these console wars that there would be, well, it used to be. There used to be these console wars every 5 years. And in the early days of video games, there could be new systems that would come out and try to jockey for attention and try to steal the thunder of maybe one of the older players. That doesn't really happen now. Now we've got Nintendo, Xbox, and PlayStation, and that's about it. There's also some weird incursions by PC gaming and mobile gaming, but that's its own sort of separate entity, although they are having an influence on video games as a whole. Anyway, so we're going to talk about the Sega Genesis and how it was both a gift and a curse to Sega. So we can't talk about that without going all the way back to the beginning, and one of the reasons that it was so successful was because of a guy named Hayao Nakayama. Now, if you've listened to my podcast before, you know that I have exchanged some tough words about him. But, yeah. But you've got to give the devil his dues. So I found out that Hayao Nakayama was a contemporary of Hiroshi Yamauchi, the president of Nintendo. Now, by that I mean they were about the same generation. I don't think the dudes ever knew each other. They were different in their temperament, though, whereas Hiroshi Yamauchi grew up raised by his grandparents and had an almost Charles Dickens-esque upbringing. Hayao Nakayama grew up with his nuclear family, and it was hoped that he would grow up to follow the family tradition of becoming a doctor. But he actually decided, I'm not going to follow the family tradition. I'm going to go and be a jukebox salesman, which is like what he really wanted to do. So next thing is, when his company that he was working for didn't want to sell arcade games, he was like, you know what? You guys are wrong. I'm going to do my own thing. So he got some colleagues and they created a company. I believe it was called Tesco. Not the British supermarket thing, but let me see. No, it was Esco. My bad. Esco Trading. That was formed in 1967. So anyway, they formed that, and then later on in the 70s, they were bought out by Sega, which was then a subsidiary of Gulf and Western Industries. And one of the things is they bought that company mostly because of Nakayama's leadership. And it was Nakayama who saw that consoles were becoming a dominant force that challenged the supremacy of the arcade video games. And so he was the one, you could say that he was the genesis of Sega's home console market, as well as the harbinger of its doom. Although, wouldn't that have been funny if, like, Sega's last system was called Harbinger? Wouldn't have boded well for them. Dreamcast is much nicer sounding. Anyway, so Hayao Nakayama was responsible for saying, like, hey, we should get into the home video game console. And they launched their first one, the SG-100, around the same time that Nintendo introduced their Famicom, what would be known as the NES in America, just 2 years later in 1985. So, funny thing is, Japan didn't have a video game crash like we did in the US. In the US, there were video game systems a dime a dozen. Pretty much every electronics system was making a system, and pretty much everybody who did anything with software was making video games. And a lot of them were rubbish. And that led to people being like, I don't want to buy this because it's crap. It doesn't work on this game, doesn't work on this system. And yeah, so people kind of hit the pause button on video games. And 2 years later, it took Nintendo to bring it back in the US. So not to get distracted by Nintendo, because this is a Sega video. So what happened is Nakayama is responsible for bringing about the SG-1000. Now, it does okay, and but it doesn't do as well as they had hoped for. Now, the interesting thing is Sega's systems, the SG-100 and the Mega Drive, no, not the Mega Drive, the Master System, two of the preceding systems that led up to the Genesis, they did really well in other places. Like, for whatever reason, Sega did really, really good in Brazil and really, really good in, like, England. For whatever reason, those are markets that Nintendo had a rough time in. But anyway, the SG-1000 and the Master System, they thrived there. But they didn't do well in the markets that Sega really wanted, the US and Japan. So it was around 1988 that Sega decided, let's go to America. And the system did okay for a little bit, but it didn't really do well until a guy named Tom Kalinske, who used to work at Hasbro and was responsible for making Barbie popular again. He was like, hey, here's what we need to do. Lower the price and include that game Sonic the Hedgehog as the pack-in game. And senior executives at Sega were like, that's our best game. You want to give it away for free? And Nakayama's like, look, I hired this guy to turn things around. Let's give him a shot. We're not doing so great already. So they followed Kalinsky's advice, and they did great. And the Sega Genesis was the first video game system in the US to give Nintendo a run for their money. In Japan, it wasn't Sega that did that. It was a game called the PC Engine. It basically had an 8-bit processor that was backed up by like 16-bit graphics card. I believe that was the case. If for all the tech people who might be listening to this, forgive me if I got that wrong. I'm going to do a video about the PC Engine, and any incongruities will be addressed there. But yeah, the PC Engine was the first video game system in Japan. Okay, so it says that the PC Engine had an 8-bit CPU and a dual 16-bit graphics processing unit chipset consisting of a video display controller and a video coloring encoder. So I wasn't too far off. I just said it much less elegantly. So anyway, they were the first to challenge Nintendo's supremacy in Japan. Sega didn't get to do that. They just did meh, okay. But they'd done well in Brazil, they'd done well in England, and there were other places. So they figure, why can't we do well in America and Japan? So Tom Kalinske gave them their real first taste of success anywhere. So yeah, Sonic was a hit, and if you grew up in the 90s, you're like, you know what I'm talking about. And if more recently, if you've seen the Sonic the Hedgehog movies, there's two of them of this video. That's kind of a taste of what things were like back then. Except we didn't have decent video game movies back then. We had Super Mario Brothers with John Leguizamo as Luigi. And for whatever reason, they focused on him more than they did Bob Hoskins' Mario, I feel. But anyway, another video for another time. You know what? I'm going to do a podcast about the Super Mario Brothers movie one day because we've got a Super Mario Brothers movie coming out in 2023 featuring Chris Pratt as Mario. So that'll be something. Anyway, back to the Genesis. So the funny thing is, I mentioned earlier that Sega, their first one, the SG-1000, their first video game console. So it was powered on something called the Zilog Z80 processing chip. Now that has an interesting story. So Zilog, they still exist today, but back they're a different company than they used to be. So these days they make processors for what's called an embedded system. An embedded system is basically where the user doesn't really get to interact with the processor. It's something like, the computer stuff for stoplights, what is it? It's like the electronics you find in your coffee maker, your microwave oven, your fridge, all those sorts of things where you don't mess with the nuts and bolts of the computer. Now, an unembedded system is more something like, you know, a computer where you get to sort of, go in and interact with the software. But that, again, another video for another time. So the funny thing about them is, their history. This is just an interesting little aside. So the guy responsible for that was an Italian man named Federico Fagan. Um, he worked at a place called Fairchild. He was the dude who introduced the idea of silicon chips for transistors. And they're like, it'd be too expensive to switch to that system. So he left and he joined some dudes at a place called Intel. And they do pretty well. But lo and behold, he finds himself in the same boat where they don't want to do something because it's too expensive. So he goes ahead and he becomes a part of like the Zilog company. I'm abbreviating this heavily, but if you want to look more, either go look it up or I'll do a video later on. So the funny thing is about the Zilog, for the SG-1000, I think the reason that Sega went with that was because it was a widely used chip and it had been around since 1973, and what else? Oh yeah, other video game systems like the Coleco had used it, as well as a lot of arcade systems like the Pac-Man. So there were people who were familiar with the architecture, and I have a feeling that's why they decided to use that for their sort of maiden voyage when it came to the video game console system. Um, it is interesting though, for their main CPU when they went to the Genesis, they switched to let's see, they switched to Motorola's 6800, I believe. Now, they still used Zilog, but as an embedded chip for the Genesis's sound system. And if you know anything about the Genesis, like the sound was a big part of it, as well as the lightning fast graphics. Um, Funny thing is, Apple almost used a Motorola, but they used the 6502 processor instead because it was cheaper. And I imagine that's one reason why Sega waited all the way until like the late 80s to try and use this. But I'm getting way too nerdy. So, interestingly enough, one more thing about the Zilog Z80 or Z80 as some know it. Funny thing is, when the Game Boy was being developed, um, the Gunpei Yokoi wound up creating an architecture that was similar. It was partially based on the Z80 and also partially based on one of Intel's processors. So it's funny how those coalesced. I imagine he did that because he wanted to create as little barriers for potential developers. So he wanted to create something familiar for them. So anyway, so Hayao Nakayama got it right with hiring Tom Kalinske. And this would pretty much be the one good decision that he made. So fast forward a couple years later, and we're about to get into the 3D video game war. And wouldn't you know, Hayao Nakayama gets this idea of like, we got to jump the ship. If you do any online research about Nakayama, you'll find that this was a recurring habit and what eventually led to him leaving after the Sega Saturn. So anyway, what happens is like it's funny. I imagine kind of a Rick Sanchez-esque meltdown, like, Morty, we gotta jump ahead of the competition, and like I don't know, shoot, I forgot the dude's name. Oh yeah, Klinsky. I imagine him as sort of the Morty figure, like, oh Nakayama, are you sure? Because the Genesis is doing really well in North America. And he's like, I don't care. We're not doing great in Japan. We got to come up with something. Anyway, so what happens is they come up with something called the 32X. That was a way of boosting the Genesis to be a 32-bit system. Now, the funny thing is, they were just like maybe a year or so ahead of releasing what would become the Sega Saturn. So it gave them little time to develop the 32X. It gave third party developers very little time to come up with anything for it. And it made consumers be like, what's going on? There's a new system. Why would we want to get this thing? I think the reasoning was that, hey, if you want to get a 3D system, you don't have to just sell your Genesis. You can have that, and you can also play your old 16-bit games. But instead, it just made them look greedy. Plus, I've watched videos about using the 32X, and it is anything but simple. If it was something where you could just if it was something where you could just stick the system in and that was it, that'd be more tenable, but it needed its own power system and you had to have it didn't include it needed all these cables that were not included. So, yeah, no wonder it didn't do well. And I think it did this disastrous thing where it released well ahead of time. So, Hayao Nakayama's wanting to one up the competition. Um, yeah, it's a stark contrast to Hiroshi Yamauchi, who told Shigeru Miyamoto, hey, if you need more time to develop the N64 and Super Mario 64, take it because we don't want a rushed product. Yeah, it's like a world of difference. So, anyway, 32X comes out, and then the Sega Saturn, and big surprise, they don't do that well, at least in America. I'm sure the 32X didn't endear itself towards anyone in Japan, but the Sega Saturn, it did great in Japan. In fact, it was their first huge success in their native country. And so Hayao Nakayama's like, oh, this is great. The US, it was a different story. Now, it's funny. So, one of the reasons it didn't do too well in the US is, again, um, third-party developers, they were trying to develop stuff for the 32X, and then they find out, oh, we've also got the Saturn coming up. So, no surprise, Sony snags a lot of those third-party developers for the PlayStation because it's fun. So Sega kind of seemed like the erratic, unpredictable boyfriend, whereas Sony was like the stable dude with a consistent job who wasn't abusive. So that's the best analogy I can give there. So no surprise that Sega lost a lot of third-party developers. So, and one of the things that surprises me is they decided, hey, let's not worry about making a Sonic game for the Sega Saturn, because you pretty much needed to if you want to do the US, like be a part of that market. But their focus was trying to succeed in Japan. That was a big thing for Hayao Nakayama, and he basically ignored the country where you could say he ignored a lot of the countries where they were successful. The dude just, I don't know. I looked his Wikipedia up before I did this video, and apparently he's still doing business. And that kind of baffles me because when you look at the failure of his tenure at Sega, you'd be like, who wants to work with this dude? And surprisingly enough, he's still alive. I think he's a little bit older than Hiroshi Yamauchi. I'd have to double check, or maybe a little bit younger. But Hiroshi Yamauchi, who passed away in 2013, it's kind of crazy how he was Yamauchi was more successful, but he passed, and Nakayama, who floundered his career, he's still sort of limping on. I don't want to make light of it, but it almost doesn't seem fair. But it's sort of almost fitting within their character. Yamauchi bowing out gracefully, whereas Nakayama begrudgingly carrying on. I'm not wishing ill upon him. I'm just saying the parallel is interesting. So to no one's surprise, Nakayama steps down after the failure of the Saturn. But now you should think, okay, this dude's gone. It's smooth sailing for Sega from here on out. But that's not the case. The Dreamcast had similar problems, although it did sell like a lot better, but pretty much Nakayama had damaged the culture of the company, and certainly had damaged any goodwill towards Sega's fans who felt kind of like, really, we were good to you guys. You're going to treat us this way? Whereas it seemed that Sony was, their PlayStation was the cool kid that Genesis used to be, and they could also appeal to the family demographic that Nintendo was known for. They got the best of both worlds. They didn't ostracize anyone, which is why like the PlayStation and PS2 were some of the best-selling video game home console systems ever. And so now Sega is a third-party developer. They develop software, they bowed out of the video game console market, and this is ancient history. I actually remember exactly where I was when I found out that Sega was giving up the video game console game. No pun intended. Maybe slightly. I was with my grandpa, and we were in the military PX in San Antonio, and we walked by the magazine rack, and I picked up a video game magazine, and I think that might have been one of the headlines on the magazine. And I turned to the article, and I'm like, wow, like Sega's not making video game systems anymore. And I didn't get the finer mechanics of why, but it's like, honestly, I'm surprised that they had that sort of moment of sobriety that led to the success of the Genesis. And if you look at what they did, and if you look at the fall of every other video game company that kind of tried to say there's a new kid on the block, in some way they kind of copy the failure or an aspect of the failure of Sega. More specifically, I should say Hayao Nakayama. And it's really interesting that nobody seems to learn. But who knows? Really, the only people who have made incursions are PC gaming and mobile phones. Like, you could say that video games are Nintendo, Xbox, PlayStation, and then mobile phones and PCs. I don't see a new player coming into the playground anytime soon. I heard that Steam has sort of a Switch knockoff, which I've heard people make rave reviews about that. So who knows? We'll just have to wait and see. Well, anyway, this video went on a bit longer than I expected. Um, yeah, I think I should have had a bit more caffeine before I started this one. But anyway, this has been the David Wells Experiment. As I say always, have an absolutely super day, and we will see you next time. Bye.